Morning. Morning.
Morning.
Morning.
Good morning.
Morning. Morning.
Morning.
Was ist Skifahren? Wochenende?
I suggest you turn off you mute yourself.
Please, all participants, mute yourself, and when we have Q&A session, we can you will open the microphones and the cameras.
Morning.
Was ist Skifahren?
Somebody is talking. I suggest you turn off you mute yourself. Somebody is talking about skiing on the weekend.
Please, all participants, mute yourself, and when we have Q&A session, we can you will open the mic.
I think it was me. I had the YouTube stream in the background, so I should have muted myself. Sorry. So maybe that's the time to start officially. I'm sorry that I was the one who was not muted, and we played the YouTube stream in a loop. So good morning. My name is Daniela Kraus. I'm the General Secretary of the Presseclub Concordia. We are currently here in Vienna, Austria. Concordia is the oldest press club in the world. It was founded in 1859. Welcome to everybody who hasn't joined one of our talks so far. This is a series of talks about contexts and backgrounds, and it's authored by Mirjana Tomic. Good morning, Mirjana. And
good morning.
It is a cooperation between the Press Club and FIUM, the Forum for Journalism and Media in Vienna. And actually, when we planned this talk, it was because RT planned to come to Austria and open an outlet because it was banned in Germany. So we decided to invite Stephen Hutchings. Stephen, good morning.
Morning. Nice to see you all.
Nice to see you. To give us some background on RT and how it works and what are the meanings between what we are reading here. And so the situation changed totally. And now we will talk maybe about more recent happenings, but still it's our intention to give some background and to learn about how RT is working and what is the modus operandi of RT and what is its impact. So that's it from my side. I only have to say, please mute yourself when you are not speaking. This talk is recorded and also live streamed via YouTube. So first you can rewatch, but second, if you ask during the live Q&A session that we will have afterwards, this will be recorded as well. So please note that. So that's it from my side, and I hand over to Mirjana. Mirjana, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Daniela. Thank you very much, Stephen, for joining us. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon in some parts of the world. These are very difficult times, and things are changing very, very fast. Between the moment Daniela suggested the topic and Stephen and I discussed it, everything has changed, or hasn't it? I'm not so sure. So let me just start very briefly. The idea is to understand how RT functions, who does it reach, and then to assess if it is a security threat, because Brussels, the European Union, and many countries are deciding to ban RT. So according to the Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, the freedom of expression can be suspended in case of security threat. And before, I also have the feeling that since Brussels announced, and some countries are now reviewing if they should allow RT to be seen, I have the feeling that people who have never heard of it are actually watching it, and all of a sudden it is off screen, like it is in Austria since yesterday, because the main cable provider decided to ban it. So before we discuss RT, I would like Stephen, who is world expert on the topic, and we shall have now his CV in the chat as well as the link to his study, to explain to us how does RT work, how many people work there, what is the relationship between RT editors and political authorities. Let's have a background so that we all know what we are talking about. So Stephen and I will talk for about 30 minutes, and then it will be open for Q&A. Stephen, please, the floor or the screen is yours, and thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, well, thank you. That's quite a lot to get through. I will talk very briefly, and then you can prompt me with more questions, because I don't want to hog the floor for too long. I mean, RT is an instrument of the Russian state. It was set up as such, and its budget is provided by the Russian state overwhelmingly. It does earn, in certain jurisdictions, it does earn a little bit of money from cable subscriptions and even advertising, but it's financed overwhelmingly by the Russian state, and it has a very generous budget, both by comparison with other Russian media outlets, but also by comparison with other world international broadcasters. So currently the budget stands at approximately 350 million euros per year, and that is sort of approximately parallel with BBC World Service. One can complicate things by breaking down the different streams that make up the BBC World Service, but RT's budget is certainly on a par with BBC World Service. It is higher than that of France 24. It is higher than that of Deutsche Welle. It is higher than either Voice of America or Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, though combined, those two broadcasters have a slight edge on RT. So it is the fact that it receives such generous funding is already indicative of the importance that the state and the Kremlin attribute to it. It broadcasts and has content in a range of languages, total 7. So though not all of these have broadcast wings. So the languages in which you will find RT content include Russian, French, English, German, Arabic, Spanish, and there is a small presence in Mandarin, although that is negligible, which in itself is quite interesting. Of those, it is only English, French, Spanish, and Arabic for which you will find broadcast content. Of course, there has been a question over German, and that was actually the context for the conversation that as originally conceived. With English, there are in fact 2 versions. There's RT UK and RT US. So overarching those 2 channels, there's RT International, which is the kind of umbrella organization that generates much of the content, and so RT in our US and RT UK will share content produced by RT International, but then there is local content broadcast by RT UK and RT US, And then similarly, the other broadcast channels do produce some local content. And there is a degree of cross-pollination and sharing. So some content made by RT France, for example, will occasionally appear on RT UK with subtitles or as usual dubbing in this context. It is a very large presence now in the international broadcasting arena. There are total, at least as things stand currently, of 22 offices around the world. The staffing numbers, as far as the most recent information suggests, include a total staff cohort of some 2,856, of whom around 1,000 are journalists. So that is quite a significant presence. As to audiences, this is a difficult area because the figures, well, first of all, they change, but also they're contested. If you go to RT's website, it'll tell you that it reaches 700 million people across the world. That's a deception. That is its potential reach. Should everyone who could access RT did access, then potentially, theoretically, it could reach 700 million people. It doesn't, and it doesn't come anything near that. Its television audience figures are, certainly as far as the Western world are concerned, modest, to put it kindly. So in the UK, as I say, the figures vary from week to week and year to year, but it's thought to have an audience share about 0.02, 0.03%, which is very low. And the weekly viewers between 300 and 500,000. This is of course, Britain has a population of over 60 million. In the US, it's slightly larger, as one would expect. It runs into the low millions. Should say that for RT UK, it can broadcast within the framework of Freeview. So we have a Freeview package which allows every license fee payer to watch any channel that included within Freeview. So as well as the BBC, CNN, and et cetera, RT. In the US, if you want to watch RT, it's generally by cable, so you have to take out a subscription. But still, the figures are modest. Where things begin to change is if you look at RT Spanish and RT Arabic, where the figures, the viewing, and bear in mind I'm talking about viewing figures for broadcast television, that are much better. So as things were when I last checked, the most successful broadcasting channel for RT is Spanish, and has viewing figures across the continent of 17 million or so. For RT Arabic, it's around 11 or 12 million. And just again to put this into context, this is RT Arabic is ranked sort of second or third in that region. So it is competitive in the Middle East, and it is certainly competitive in Latin America. It's really not competitive elsewhere in terms of its broadcast audience. It does better with social media. So its YouTube channels have quite a high hit rate. It boasts that it was the first YouTube channel to hit 1 billion viewers, and its YouTube channel now attracts sort of some 4.5 billion. Now, on the face of it, that's quite impressive, but what one has to remember is that the content that features on RT's YouTube channels is very often the kind of trivia that one is used to finding on YouTube. It's clickbait, it's celebrity gossip, it's sort of, your archetypal cat videos, etc., which RT is very, very good at picking up on. The theory is that viewers will watch this clickbait and then progress to watching the more politicized, political videos. There's not much evidence that is happening. So, those headline figures are, again, somewhat misleading. With Twitter, it's modestly successful. As far as our figures indicate, there are over 2 million followers of its Twitter feed, but that, again, to give you some comparison, compares with 25 million for the BBC and 54 million for CNN. Instagram, it's a newcomer to Instagram. The figures are quite low, but it is one of the fastest growing Instagram performers. So, as I say, it's just to summarize the audience figures, the audience impact. It's a somewhat mixed picture. But I think one can generalize by saying that certainly in the Western hemisphere, its TV audience figures are negligible. In the Middle East and Latin America, they're much better. Social media, it is a growing presence, but it is still modest if you compare it with the likes of BBC or CNN. I think you asked about, sorry, I've slightly lost track of the question. I think you asked about...
There are two more things that the time is running really fast. I would like you to mention two things, if possible. One is, what is the relationship between who really sets the political content? What is the relationship between, like, we know that the director of Russia Today, or RT, Simonian, she has been there since 2005, and she started as a 25-year-old woman. And what is the relationship between the leadership or management of RT and the political authorities? Who sets the agenda? And if you can shortly explain how RT adapts to different viewers depending when they are. In Latin America, they have a far left agenda, and in Western Europe, a far right agenda. Could you just explain that, and who their main commentators are that are starting to leave? Just about 3 or 4 minutes, and then we go if there are security and the democracy threat.
These are really important questions, particularly the first one that you asked about, the sort of who sets the agenda, who sets the content. Not least because if we're going to go on to talk about banning and regulating, the BBC's regulator banned or removed the broadcasting license of CGTN, the Chinese state broadcaster, mainly on the grounds that its content is directly mandated by the Chinese state. Now, one could make a similar argument about RT. Simonian, as you said, is the editor-in-chief. She's a very, very powerful figure. She is one of a small circle of media executives who, together with Kremlin officials, set the broad news agenda for the whole of Russian media via weekly meetings. So the small group of media executives, including Simonyan, will agree news agendas on a week-by-week basis and then roll them out across state-sponsored, state-controlled media. Simonyan has little kind of involvement in the sort of day-to-day production of content and shaping of content of news broadcasts. That is delegated to, first of all, to a head of news who kind of oversees news production across RT, and then so it is a hierarchical organization, and then each of the constituent channels will have a head of newsroom. All of these people are Russian. And so the reporting line is direct from the channels through the overarching head of news to Simonyan and then upwards. But at the local level, these heads of newsroom, they will determine their own content, except with the exception of particularly politically sensitive issues.
And now we are in those times.
Exactly. So when we go into a situation like the war in Ukraine, or before that, the Salisbury poisoning, the 2014 conflict, the conflict in Syria, these are considered politically sensitive issues for which Simonyan and the top media executives want to see a consistent line. And there is little room for deviation. And so the head of each newsroom across all of these channels will be driven by what the agreed narratives are, as I say, with little room for deviation. With the less politically sensitive issues, there is much more leeway. And this brings me to the second part of your question, to what extent does the content vary across the different channels? And the answer is, outside of these big crises, there is quite a considerable degree of variation, and the content is adapted and modified according to the political and media environments in which the particular channel operates. So, for example, RT France spent a great deal of time focused on the Gilets jaunes protests when they were live. During Brexit, RT was a sort of active sort of promoter of mostly pro-Brexit narratives in the British context. And so it will cleave right or left depending on what suits its purpose in a particular environment. So
is the main purpose disruption?
Yes, the idea is that RT will work with whichever narratives show up a particular society in a bad light. And sometimes they can be narratives from the left, and sometimes they can be narratives from the right. So in Spain, for example, where the right is somewhat less of a presence, and where the connection between the Spanish right and the Kremlin is meager, the content tends to cleave left. Whereas in Germany, the RT Germany aligns itself very much with the German right. The same is somewhat true of RT France, although with RT France and RT UK, there is a certain eclecticism. So, for example, when in the British left, when to everyone's surprise, Jeremy Corbyn was elected leader of the Labour Party, a far left figure who surprisingly managed to win the leadership of the Labour Party. RT saw that as an opportunity to stir and disrupt and to promote narratives that were likely to lead to division and a breakdown in consensus. So there was support simultaneously given to the Jeremy Corbynite left, but also to the kind of Brexit promoting right. It can ride two horses at once. So it is eclectic and somewhat opportunistic. And in order for it to fulfill that function, the logical thing to do is to devolve decision making to the local level, where the staff, the journalists know the situation and know which way the wind is blowing. So it's not an act of kind of generosity in delegating decision making to the local level. It's a completely rational and logical decision given RT's remit, which broadly speaking is, yes, to stir up discontent and to highlight inequality, iniquity, the stories, to quote RT's mission, that the mainstream media aren't telling you. So that's, as probably most of you know, that is the gist of its sort of mission. We tell you the stories that your mainstream media are not telling you, and that's how they justify so rather than saying our intention is to disrupt and disturb, they will tell you no, our intention is merely to give you access to the stories that you're not being told. To come back to what I was saying, in the case of events like the war, then all of that is put to one side, and the
Please take a break.
Yeah. I'm suffering from a slight cold, but I don't want to let that interrupt my flow.
Go ahead, please. The case of war. Mm-hmm.
In the case of war, the content and the narratives are much more disciplined and much more kind of carefully shaped and consistent and in line with one another. So, as you'll appreciate, the war began only 4 or 5 days ago, and believe it or not, I don't have time to do nothing but watch RT, let alone in 6 different languages. So, to the extent that I've been able to, I've been, and with colleagues, we've been trying our very best to monitor how RT UK and RT France and indeed RT Russia are covering this event. And yeah, I mean, it is very clear that they're under clear instructions not to deviate far from the narrative that Russian domestic audiences are being fed. So, you will not find reference anywhere on RT UK or RT France to an invasion or to a war. It is a special operation. However, RT UK is operating under the jurisdiction of Ofcom, and therefore it is obliged to follow rules of impartiality. And in the case of the war, it seems to be taking, if you like, the path of least resistance. So it is sticking to the vocabulary of special operation. It is also portraying the war as a defensive effort to save Russian speakers in the east of Ukraine from hostile nationalist-led Ukrainian forces. But it is trying to be quite careful in putting those terms in quotes and contextualizing them by reference to Russian foreign minister and to officials. So it won't tell you directly this is a special operation to defeat Nazis attacking East European Russian speakers. It will report that line, put it in quotes, and then what it will also generally do, again, in order to make sure that it is minimally reaching or maintaining impartiality standards, it will often have at the bottom of the screen a ticker in which you'll see quotes to the contrary. You'll see quotes from from European leaders, NATO officials, and so on. So if you're an attentive viewer, you can listen to what the anchor is telling you, and you can also read a different narrative at the bottom on the ticker. Does that meet impartiality standards? I'm not a media regulator. It's not for me to say, but that's an argument that we have. I should also say that just two other quick things on that point. Certainly, my brief experience of watching war coverage on RT UK is that there have been slips. So there have been a number of occasions where reporters on the ground have, without quotes, referred to denazification, to Nazis or far-right nationalists forces leading the fight in eastern Ukraine. Yeah, so without any quotation marks, and that's a slip. So that if I were a media regulator, which I'm not, I would pinpoint that as a clear breach of impartiality. The other quick point to make, because I don't want to, I could say a lot more, but I don't want to kind of hog the floor. As far as I can tell, there has been a slight kind of parting of ways between RT UK. Well, I'll say two things. There's been slight parting ways between RT UK and RT France. Broadly speaking, I have observed rather more diversity on RT France. I've not seen the words war or invasion used, but I've seen the words intervention and offensive. Okay. I've also seen on RT France headlines about Turkey's objections to Russian actions. RT UK has been much more nervous about in any way deviating from the line. This, now, one could have a discussion about why this is. It may well be that, I mean, RT France has been under very, very close scrutiny from none other than Macron himself. And it may well be that it has got wind of the fact that it was, it was under the cosh, and therefore has kind of been ultra cautious in modifying its approach in order basically to remain functioning. It's also, I think, probably regarding RT France, also true to say that RT had great hopes of RT France. It was really excited about the launch of RT France. This was at the height of the Gilets jaunes. It saw a real opportunity there. Plus, importantly, not to forget, Russia generally has its eyes on Africa, and of course, North Africa is French-speaking, and I think it saw RT France as a way to kind of get its message out into Africa.
May I step in, because it's all, I promised the audience. You promised the audience half an hour. Can I just ask you to reply very fast, and then I shall give the floor to the audience. is RT a threat to security now? A, and B, are we overblowing its importance by discussing if it should be banned or not? Just really briefly, we already have questions.
There are several answers to that question. On the face of it, in Simonyan's own words, RT is the broadcast arm of the Russian Ministry of Defense. Those are her words. So it is a weapon in what she sees as an information war. Russia does not recognize the concept of impartiality. It sees what is happening as an information war in which RT is defending and playing the role of the broadcast arm of the Ministry of Defense. So seen in that light, yes, you could argue that the Russian state is committing atrocities in Europe under the auspices of the arm of the Ministry of Defense. Therefore, RT has to be seen as a threat to security because it is part of that apparatus. The other approach, the approach that I tend to take, is perhaps you could say more pragmatic, which is that it's certainly as far as its broadcast output content is concerned, its impact is minimal, and that first of all, by talking it up, one actually gives it fuel, the very fuel that it seeks. By banning it, it's kind of conforms to the Russian narrative about Western hypocrisy, about the media not telling you the stories you don't want to hear. And finally, I would be very surprised, again, I've been proved wrong on a number of occasions in the course of this crisis, but I'd be very surprised if the banning of RT in Europe and perhaps in Britain would not lead to a reciprocal banning of BBC France 24. Deutsche Welle has already, I believe, been banned, and this is not good. This means that the counter narratives, the messages that we want to get to the ordinary Russian people, they are deprived of access to that. So there is an argument to be had. It's not clear cut, but if you ask me my own sympathies, they would lie with the latter line. But I can certainly see the case and the rationale for seeing RT as part of the whole state apparatus, and that therefore it's just.
I'm going to read these questions because it is our colleague Markus Müller from the Austrian Public Broadcaster Radio. He asks two questions. The first question is, what would the ban of RT in the EU and UK mean? Is it possible to really keep them out? That's first question. And the second question, how would you compare RT to other outlets like Sputnik?
Both very good questions. As far as the first one is concerned, how would you keep RT out? Well, first of all, we were speculating before this discussion started, to whom or to what does the ban apply? My understanding, you may correct me if I've got this wrong, my understanding is that the ban will apply to television, to RT's broadcast output. So that would be relatively easy to control. Except, of course, the fact that all that would happen is that RT would retreat to online, and you can watch RT content online. You don't have to have RT as part of a Freeview package or a cable subscription package. It is available online. And this is not to mention, of course, how on earth you keep control of RT's social media output, its web content. Though I've noticed yesterday, I was desperately trying to access RT .com, and it was subject to a hacking, and this has been happening quite persistently. But you can't hack forever, and it seems to me that actually stopping RT broadcasting is one thing that you can do. Keeping content away from people is something quite different. So and as I say, RT's biggest impact is not with its television output, certainly not in Europe. So banning is something, it seems to me, of a symbolic gesture that is not only not likely to have much of an impact, but it could actually be counterproductive. As to its relationship with Sputnik, this is an interesting question. The two they see themselves as sister channels. So they operate under the same umbrella of Россия сегодня. That's the Russian organization that oversees all international content of the Russian media. So Sputnik and RT, they work out of the same offices. They complement one another. There are differences. First of all, Sputnik doesn't have a television channel; it has a radio, for which the figures are even more pathetic than for RT television. Very, very few people listen to Sputnik radio. It has an active presence online and in social media. If one were to distinguish the two, I would say that Sputnik is the more outrageous, the more aggressive, the one that is sailing closer to the wind in terms of disinformation. If you like, it's a sort of almost good cop, bad cop relationship. By comparison with Sputnik, RT presents itself as a more of a kind of soft power purveyor, whereas Sputnik is the outright warrior. So there is some degree of complementarity and quite a lot of intersection and sharing between them, but they are different and should be treated as such.
Thank you so much. I see, please raise your hands. I see one, Georg Krauschenberg, please introduce yourself. And whoever wants to ask a question, please raise your hand and turn on your camera. And please.
Well, thank you very much, Miriam. I'm from Institute of the Danube region in Central Europe, here in Vienna. And I have two short questions. The one is concerning the situation of BBC, for instance, now in Russia. Is it possible even for people to watch or to listen? Because one of the arguments you placed that RT was not banned yet in UK is precisely that BBC may be banned. And the other short question is concerning correspondence of RT, like our foreign minister, former foreign minister Kneißl. Is she a rather unique case, or are there more of former politicians as correspondents? Thank you.
Stefan, I would like to take a couple of one more question from another colleague, and then I reply. Sergey, the floor is yours. Unmute yourself and please introduce yourself.
Yeah, hello, my name is Sergey. I'm working for University of Passau, and I'm working now on a project about so-called Internet Research Agency. And my question is also about it. So, Stephen, what do you know about the connection of RT with Evgeny Prigozhin's media businesses? So I'm speaking about Internet Research Agency, which we also know as a Troll Factory, and also media group Patriot. So it's Ria Fan, Nevsky Novosti, and other outlets. And also the third question, if you don't know about connection to these obvious ones, maybe you know about connection with so-called Russian submarines websites. So it's these proxy outlets such as Newsfront, etc. Thank
Thank
you.
you very much. Stephen, please go. Go ahead.
All very good questions, all very important questions, to which we have to give necessarily brief and probably inadequate answers. I think the concern about BBC is not so much that it simply won't be accessible. It's BBC World Service Radio through which Russian citizens can access BBC. There was, for a period of time, an arrangement that the BBC reached with television channel Dozhd, which is, or TV Rain, which is one of the few independent media outlets in Russia. It has been forced online. It can only be accessed by subscription, and until recently, I think it did manage to include some BBC television news bulletins as part of its online output. I think the concern really is that BBC presence on the ground will be banned, so there will be no BBC reporters in Moscow or anywhere else in Russia. And already one prominent BBC journalist has had a visa revoked. This was before the war. This is well before the war, and the same has happened to other reporters. So it's less depriving people of access to the BBC and other such broadcasters. It's more depriving these broadcasters of the ability to report on the ground and give Russian viewers an authoritative, evidence-based account of what is happening in their country that is not that of the state propaganda outlets. That would be the concern. You also asked about to what extent RT tends to employ former politicians. Yes, that is one of its strategies. And in the UK, for example, Alex Salmond, who was the leader of the Scottish Nationalist Party, had his own show. And it was only last week that, under a great deal of pressure from across the political spectrum, he agreed to suspend his arrangement with RT. So until then, he had his own talk show on RT, and he was always very careful to stress that, yes, I'm broadcasting on RT, but I have complete editorial control. I can do and ask and say whatever I want. I'm not in any way impeded in that. There is a different arrangement between RT and its kind of big star presenters, who are given much more freedom and leeway than are the sort of run-of-the-mill presenters and reporters on the ground. George Galloway is an he's switched horses so often I lost track, but he was originally a sort of fiery left-wing firebrand member of the Labour Party, and then he aligned himself with the sort of anti-Islamophobic wing of the left, and launched his own party to protest against what he perceived was Islamophobia. So he has an agenda that aligns itself with RT, just as Alex Salmond, with his support for Scottish independence, has a position that is aligned with what is convenient to RT. Both of those, say, were given their own shows. Galloway's is extremely outrageous, and when RT UK has been investigated for breaches of impartiality, as it has on several occasions, Galloway's show has almost always one of the prime culprits. Now, that's not because he's being told to provoke and upset and misinform. That's what he likes to do. My guess is that he does it, often to the inconvenience and annoyance of RT. So, yeah, these star presenters do have to be sort of considered separately. And star presenters, it's a risk from RT, but on RT's part. Sometimes these star presenters go off message. So I think Galloway is one example. In the States, you had the case of Abby Martin, who was a big figure in the Occupy movement. Do you remember the Occupy movement? She was given her own show, full editorial independence, and in the 2014 Ukraine crisis, live on air, she condemned Russia's annexation of Crimea. She's an anti-imperialist and she stuck to her guns, and that was an act of imperialism, and she said so to her viewers and kept her job for a year. So, these star presenters are a case unto themselves, which is why it was an important question. I was also asked about the possible relationship between RT and Prigozhin and the troll factory, the IRA. These connections are often hazy, and I'm not an intelligence specialist. My strong sense is that it would be a mistake to see the two as closely connected. I think a big mistake that we have often made when interpreting Russian sort of communications strategy is that it is a single, coordinated, disciplined, hierarchical apparatus in which everyone is working in sync with one another according to a single agreed strategy. I really don't think that is the case. What the trolls are doing under the auspices of Prigozhin in St. Petersburg has very, very little connection with what RT does. And in a way, it makes sense. They have very, very different functions, very, very different modes of operation, and this sort of hierarchical information war narrative that we tend to promote about RT is often misleading and incorrect. It comes into play in the context of situations like the one that we're in now, where there is suddenly a sort of coming together and a degree of coordination that we don't otherwise see. I would still doubt that RT has much to do with the IRA. However, RT clearly is plugged into the security apparatus, and that goes back to Mirjana's very first question. During the 2014 Ukraine crisis, you'll remember that there was some rather embarrassing leaks of telephone conversations, private telephone conversations that EU officials were having with Ukrainian politicians. And guess which the first broadcaster was to leak them? Well, you don't need to guess. It was RT, and it's very, very credible to believe that the security apparatus had a direct connection, probably via Simanyan, to RT, and in that situation, it made sure that RT was the first to the scoop. But it would, as I say, it would be wrong to think that that's the way that RT always operates. And then, what was the second? There was another question, a question that I've missed. Oh, the proxy. Yes, that's another very interesting and complicated question. There's no question that as well as RT and Sputnik, the Kremlin has had involvement in setting up these kind of proxy media outlets that to all intents and purposes, look like local, kind of often far right or conspiracy theory promoting websites. They normally are websites, but in fact, if you look at the kind of the contact details and the metadata, all roads lead back to Moscow. There are several of these, and the Newsfront is one of them. Again, my sense is that the degree of coordination between the likes of RT and Newsfront is fairly minimal, though what you will find is that, and we saw this actually during the COVID pandemic, when RT, you would sometimes see a link to a story on Newsfront and other such proxy sites. So they're aware of one another, and Newsfront will often also provide links to RT. So there is a cross-linking between the two, but I would hesitate to say that this is part of a single grand strategy.
Thank you. We have a question here from Simon Kravagna, who is one of my directors of our film. It's behind me. What kind of journalists work for RT? Why do they do that? Is it only about money?
Yeah, these are very good questions. Of course, RT staff is made up of Russian journalists, but also journalists from the local journalists, or native speaking English, French, German, Russian, and Spanish. Why do they choose to work for RT? They do pay good salaries. They do also, and we have, I'm certainly not going to name any names, but we have, as part of we have actually talked to RT staff, both current RT staff and ex-RT staff, and we've asked them these sorts of questions ourselves, and some of them are quite open about the fact that the pay packages are generous. They also say that, however, it is very, very difficult to gain promotion. So you have this initial entry package, which is very generous, but it is next to impossible to progress beyond there. Some of them are aspiring journalists who find that RT is a kind of, or they perceive RT as a stepping stone. Very inexperienced. And RT is quite deliberate about employing young, inexperienced journalists whom they can mold and train. Some of them are genuinely motivated by RT's mission. And they do see it as an opportunity to promote some of the agendas that they themselves are sympathetic to. So the motivations are different, but the financial remuneration is certainly a factor. I should also, perhaps this is slightly off the point, but I think it's important. If you watch RT, or if you read RT online, you'll find they often refer to experts whom they quote and whom they interview. Many of those experts are people no one has heard of. In fact, one would question the extent to which they are experts at all. They are people who conveniently will say the things that RT would expect and want them to say to support whatever narrative it is they're promoting. That said, RT is in something of a kind of chicken and egg scenario. It is desperate to legitimize itself by including comment from respectable experts who command authority. And so it tries to invite credible politicians, experts, academics, most of whom want nothing to do with it. And therefore it is forced to resort to these figures who really have very, very little credibility at all. I myself have been asked to appear on RT twice, and on each occasion I've refused because I just don't think it would be appropriate for me to appear on that channel. But it is very clear that they would much rather have somebody like me come and speak to them and challenge them, and perhaps say things that they don't want to hear in order to increase their credibility and respectability, than to have to resort to this rather dismal array of non-experts whose affiliation is often not even mentioned.
Why did you refuse?
I suppose the first reason was that, you know, they approached me in the middle of the project, and I, as an academic, as someone who wants to try to study things impartially and objectively, I didn't see it as entirely appropriate to be appearing on the very sort of organization whom I was supposed to be studying from a distance. So that was the reason I gave them. To be perfectly frank, I would feel quite uncomfortable about appearing on RT now when our project isn't running, and that's regardless of the war. Because it's not an outlet that I have any sympathy with.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I don't see any more questions. It's 10 o'clock, but can I ask you a very fast question myself? As a former war reporter, I remember that although everyone was lying, all sides were lying, the truth is the first thing to die in any conflict. We still watched both sides, and we all, even those on the front line, watched both sides. The question is, if RT is prohibited, shall we be deprived of watching what the other side says?
I think that's a good point. Yes, I think rather than saying we don't want to hear what the other side is saying because it's propaganda and disinformation, it's much better to hear what that disinformation is and to be able to robustly challenge it, rather than to be scared of it and to be seen to be hiding it from either from ourselves or from our fellow citizens. So I take the view that it is much better to have it out in the open, and to challenge it and to show it up for what it is, rather than having it hidden away. And then you will get more, I can't remember the gentleman who asked the question about the proxy sites, but there you will have much more deception in the form of these pretend sites, which create much more of a problem. So for several reasons, my own view is that we shouldn't be scared. We should engage with it and challenge it robustly.
I thank you so much, Stephen. If any of the journalists want to interview, I think that Stephen will he would agree. I thank you for giving us this incredible overview. We have posted the link to your website of your huge project at the University of Manchester and Open University, where journalists and researchers and regulators who have joined today will have the opportunity to learn more. And I really hope that peace prevails, which is more important than anything else. Thank you. And Daniela, please.
All I want to say is thank you, Stephen. Thank you, everybody, for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you. I enjoyed it. Thank you for the questions. They were all excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.